Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History Podcast, Episode 5. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. A quick update on the podcast. First, I want to thank my financial supporters on Patreon. Your support helps cover the costs of maintaining the website and encourages me to continue producing high-quality content. We recently conducted our first topic poll on Patreon for the $10 a month supporters, and that poll determined the topic for Series 4. The winner? The Fall of France in 1940. So, this is Series 2 on the Korean War. The Battle off Samar will be next, Series 3, and then the Fall of France will be Series 4. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Patreon, YouTube, and the Wheels of History podcast website. Alright, now this episode is the start of a new series on the Korean War, the war which lasted from 1950 to 1953 and was the first hot war of the Cold War. When I was doing research for this series at the public library, I was struck by the contrast between the number of books covering the Korean War compared to World War II. World War II took up an entire stack with hundreds of books, and in contrast, the Korean War section had about a dozen books. The Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, was overshadowed by the massive scale and consequences of the Second World War on one hand, and then the cultural impact that the Vietnam War had on the American people. And yet, the United States suffered 128,000 casualties in Korea, including 36,000 deaths, 4 times the casualties we suffered in the entire Iraq War. And the ramifications of the Korean War last to the present day, with North Korean saber-rattling, nuclear tests, and missile launches threatening the stability of the region. Furthermore, I find this conflict very fascinating, not only because I was stationed in Korea for 3 years, but because this is the first time the United States really came to grips with how to fight a war with the specter of World War III and nuclear weapons looming in the background. Furthermore, the conflicts between President Truman and General MacArthur raised questions over civilian control of the U.S. military. So in this first episode, we're going to look at the background leading up to the Korean War, and then the first several months of the war in which the North Korean army drove the South Koreans and Western powers to the southern corner of the peninsula. General Matthew B. Ridgway, future commander of the U.S. and UN forces in the Korean War, wrote a book about his experiences aptly titled The Korean War. And he starts his book by saying that it's impossible to understand the Korean War without an understanding of the historical and cultural context of the region. So what better place to start than there? Korean history stretches back thousands of years, and the Korean people are ethnically distinct from the Chinese and the Japanese. The mountainous Korean peninsula, roughly the same size as the British Isles, is about 450 miles from north to south and about 120 miles east to west. It's separated from the Japanese islands by the Strait of Tsushima, about 40 miles wide at its narrowest point. And much like Poland, Korea is stuck between 2 larger powers, China to the north and Japan to the south. And its location has served as a flashpoint for conflict between those 2 larger powers. Because China historically has been the greater power, Korea spent large periods of its history as the client kingdom of the Chinese. At the start of the 20th century, China had been in decline for some time relative to Europe. Ever since the Opium Wars in the 1830s, the European powers used their technological and industrial superiority to enforce their will on China, forcing China to open ports to Western trade, ceding some cities along the coast as concessions to the European powers, which included countries such as Britain, France, Portugal, even Germany, Belgium, and Italy. China knows that they have to change to catch up to the West, but they are falling short in trying to adopt cultural, educational, technological, and industrial reforms while also trying to maintain their own cultural identity and traditions. In contrast, Japan is rising. Japan had been closed to outside trade for hundreds of years until the United States forcibly ended that isolation in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor with his warships. Japan quickly adopted European dress and technologies, and in the space of a few decades, termed the Meiji Restoration, Japan began industrializing and becoming an imperial power in its own right. In 1876, Japan forcibly opens Korea to Japanese trade, and then in 1894, the Japanese began landing troops in Korea to counter rising Chinese influence there. The Japanese felt that the Korean peninsula was, quote, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, end quote, and wanted to control it. Indeed, when the Mongols occupied China and Korea in the 13th century, they launched 2 invasions of Japan from the Korean peninsula. So Japanese efforts to control Korea led to the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. In that war, Japan won a decisive victory over the Chinese forces, and in the peace talks for the war, China was forced to recognize the independence of Korea. The Chinese also had to cede the island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan, to Japan, along with some other territories, and paying them 8,000 tons of silver. This is extremely humiliating for the Chinese. China has had wealth, a large population, and great power in the region for over 1,000 years. They see themselves as the Middle Kingdom, that is, a central kingdom, surrounded by, as they saw it, lesser barbarian peoples that came to bow down before the emperor and offer tribute. Meanwhile, the only other major power competing in the area around Korea is the Russian Empire. However, this led to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which in turn led to the annihilation of the Russian fleet and their ultimate defeat at Japanese hands. In the aftermath of the war, Japan occupied Korea and began a program to eliminate the Korean culture, to include banning the use of Korean language and Korean names, looting cultural artifacts, and demolishing historical buildings and palaces. The Japanese proceeded to replace all positions of leadership and influence with their own people. The Koreans were considered second-class citizens, and millions of Koreans were used as forced laborers during the Second World War. There is still strong animosity against the Japanese for what they did to Korea. During the Second World War, Korea is basically ignored by the Allied forces. The Japanese occupied large swaths of China throughout the war, and were even launching successful large-scale offensives as late as 1944. The Allied forces provided the nationalist Chinese armies with significant materiel assistance, but in spite of that, the Chinese armies were fraught with corruption, low morale, and were mostly ineffective. Instead, the U.S.-led Allied forces are advancing across the Pacific from the east, with so much military power that the United States is able to sustain 2 different axes of advance against Japan, one across the Central Pacific to seize key islands, particularly the Marianas Islands, from which B-29s would be able to bombard Japan, and another drive up the South Pacific to liberate New Guinea and the Philippines. The capture of Okinawa in the summer of 1945 was the last step before invading Japan, with the invasion date set for November 1945. This planned invasion of Japan would be a massive amphibious operation that would dwarf the Normandy landings in scope and scale. Success in the Pacific had left the Japanese still in control of all of Korea and large portions of China. The Japanese had about 1 million troops alone in Manchuria and Korea. This all changes, however, in August 1945. On August 6th, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and then on August 9th, the U.S. dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. Furthermore, on August 9th, the Soviet Union breaks their non-aggression pact with Japan and invade Manchuria with 1.5 million men. Now, Manchuria is the region of China that the Japanese had taken over in the early 1930s, and this is a portion of China that's adjacent to Korea. Now, this 1.5 million men force, it's not the Red Army of 1941. These are the battle-hardened veterans who have spent the past 4 years fighting and defeating the German army, and they're bringing along some 5,000 tanks and 30,000 artillery pieces with them. In short order, the Soviets break through the Japanese lines and, as the Russians claim at their World War II museum, quote, they inflicted upon Japanese forces the heaviest defeat in World War II, end quote, killing 84,000 Japanese and capturing 640,000 prisoners. With the collapse of the Japanese lines, the Soviets are racing deep into Manchuria and seem likely to occupy all of Manchuria and Korea in a matter of weeks. Now, at the Cairo Declaration the Allies made in 1943, they promised that there would be a free and independent Korea following the end of the war. But would the Soviets keep their word? In an effort to keep the Soviets from occupying everything, the U.S. proposed to the Soviets to divide the peninsula in half, choosing the 38th parallel as the division line. Surprisingly, the Soviets agree. Stalin didn't really care about Korea. His main focus was consolidating power in Europe. And what he cared about in Asia was turning over captured Japanese equipment and material to the Communist Chinese to help in their war against the nationalists. So, when the war ends in September, the U.S., almost by accident, found itself in control of the southern half of the Korean peninsula, which included the historical capital of Korea, Seoul. Korea is a very poor country, and since the Japanese have kept Koreans out of leadership positions for decades, the U.S. occupation troops end up keeping many Japanese in their leadership roles to help maintain order. U.S. occupation troops have no civil military training and are ignorant of, or chose to overlook, past Japanese actions in Korea. As one of the local Koreans, Min Pyong-kyu, said, quote, "We thought the Americans were nice people who just didn't understand anything about Korea," end quote. As the Cold War began, the temporary division became more and more permanent between North and South. Conflict between the two Koreas began as both North and South claimed the entire peninsula for themselves. Guerrilla attacks, propaganda, and sabotage ensues. Neither the U.S. or the Soviets want to abandon their influence and let the Koreans sort it out for themselves out of fear of losing to the other side. Eventually, South Korea holds their own elections, declaring Syngman Rhee as president of the Republic of Korea. Rhee establishes a military dictatorship in democratic clothing, repressing political opposition, assassinating political opponents, and restricting the press. The Soviets, for their part, are displeased that the South Koreans made their own government, so a few months later they established the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. Now, as is often the case, if you have to use the word Democratic Republic in your country name, it probably isn't. And Kim Il-sung follows the Joseph Stalin model of creating a cult of personality around himself and brutally oppressing his people. As this is happening, the Cold War is intensifying around the world. Germany is divided into occupation zones by the major powers, which would eventually become East and West Germany. And then you have the case of Berlin. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself divided into separate occupation zones. And much as in Korea, the Western powers were making steps towards formalizing the division of East and West and creating a West German state. Much has happened in Korea, the Soviets don't like it, and in this case they decided to retaliate by cutting off the rail and road connections to West Berlin until the West relents and allows the East German currency to be used exclusively in all of Berlin. Neither side was willing to start a war over this issue, in part out of a desire to avoid being seen as the aggressor on the world stage, and in part because the tens of millions of people dead and the complete devastation in Europe from World War II was still very much a real issue and fresh in everyone's mind. And oh yes, for the Russians, they don't have the atomic bomb, so going to war with the United States would probably end very badly for them. In response, the United States and the British mobilized the largest airlift in history, delivering over 2 million tons of supplies over the following year and keeping all of West Berlin supplied solely by air. Eventually, the Soviets decided to stop their blockade and end the crisis. In the bigger picture, the U.S. was focused on rebuilding Europe and limiting communist influence in the West, namely through the Marshall Plan. Europe is the center of gravity at this point in the Cold War, since at that time, Asia had little industry or economic power, and in many cases was still coming out of colonialism. Now, speaking of Asia, the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong started again. Both sides had agreed not to openly fight each other during the Japanese invasion, but both sides also knew that there could only be one winner at the end. However, aided by corruption in the nationalists and quite adept at winning support of the peasants, the communists gained the upper hand and nationalist forces collapsed in 1949. Chiang flees to Taiwan, and the communists declare the establishment of the People's Republic of China. In the United States, there is much hand-wringing domestically over how China could have been lost despite extensive support from the United States, and that in turn led to a growth of McCarthyism trying to find scapegoats in the State Department for this debacle. Meanwhile, in Korea, the U.S. withdrew its last occupation troops in June 1949, but retained a military advisory group to help train the fledgling ROK, that is, Republic of Korea, army. However, in doing so, the United States was trying to walk a fine line. They wanted to equip the ROC Army to be able to defeat North Korean infiltration attacks and guerrilla fighters, but they didn't want to equip them so lavishly that Ri will invade North Korea. Thus, they equip his army with light artillery and small arms, but no tanks and aircraft. In retrospect, a key moment took place in January 1950. The U.S. Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, is speaking to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. In it, he outlines the U.S.'s security interests in the Far East, and notably, he does not include Taiwan or Korea on the list. The Soviets take this as a sign that the U.S. has abandoned any real interest in Korea. After all, the U.S. stood aside, even with their nuclear monopoly, while China fell to the communists in 1949. The withdrawal of U.S. occupation troops and keeping Korea and Taiwan off their vital security list signaled to the Soviets that South Korea was fair game. Now, in reality, the fall of China and political pressure led the Truman administration to resolve to take a stronger stance against communism in the future. The NSC 68 paper, written in April 1950, advocated more funds for defense and served as a foundation for Truman's containment strategy against communism. Of course, the paper is top secret, and the Soviets didn't know these changes were occurring in the U.S. stance towards the region. Now, in the lead-up to the invasion, most historians agree that Kim Il-sung sought approval from Stalin and Mao before he launched his invasion. Stalin probably saw it as a low-risk way to advance Soviet and communist influence in Asia, something that would benefit him without the risk of getting directly involved, and he thought that the U.S. wouldn't contest it. Meanwhile, Mao was busy consolidating power in China, having recently taken Hainan Island in a large-scale amphibious operation. Mao doesn't want to get involved in the war either, but he releases Korean veterans from the army and then goes back to planning a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan to finish the Civil War. And so, on the eve of war, the North Korean army has about 135,000 troops facing off against 95,000 ROC soldiers. However, the North Korean army is much better equipped. Whereas South Korea has no military aircraft, the North Koreans have 200. The North Koreans also have 150 T-34-85 tanks of World War II Soviet fame and 20,000 veterans from the Chinese Civil War. The Communists launched their attack on Sunday, June 25, 1950, and this attack catches the South Koreans and the United States flat-footed. The North Korean tanks are a vital asset since the South Koreans have no effective anti-tank weapons. They have to resort to attaching satchel charges on long poles or trying to pry open hatches with crowbars, and that works out about as well as you would expect. Panic ensues. There are hordes of refugees clogging the roads, headed south trying to escape, and the ROC Army falls back. The U.S. advisors are initially told to evacuate, but on the second day of the war, General Douglas MacArthur is appointed commander of all U.S. military personnel in Korea, and he orders them to return. The panic spreads to Seoul as the North Korean armies advance, and so the South Koreans decide to blow up the bridges on the Han River, the Han being a major river running along the south side of Seoul. Of course, there are still some 44,000 soldiers, half of the ROC Army, trapped on the north bank, and while some are able to swim across the river, they have to abandon their equipment when they leave. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is awakening to news of the invasion, and this quickly becomes the first test of the United Nations. You see, the United Nations was established at the end of World War II as a way of helping preserve the peace and create a forum for nations to meet, discuss, and work out their differences together. It was also intended to address the weaknesses in the League of Nations, a group of nations after World War I with a similar vision of preventing wars, but the League of Nations failed miserably. You see, the League of Nations relied on unanimous agreement to take action, and repeatedly, from Italy's invasion of Ethiopia to Hitler's annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia, nothing material was done to stop them or deter them. And so the United Nations aimed to address these shortcomings, such as having the United Nations Security Council, which did not require a unanimous vote to permit actions, and UN peacekeepers would fight under the UN flag. The major Allied powers of World War II, the British, French, United States, China, and the Soviet Union, had a permanent seat on the Security Council and veto authority over any resolutions. When the Korean War broke out, the UN condemned the North Korean invasion and called on them to cease fire and withdraw. Of course, the North Koreans ignore this, and so the UN Security Council votes to authorize force to protect South Korea. Now, in modern times, this is a point where all this talk of action would come to nothing, because the Soviet Union has veto authority on the Security Council. This is one of the reasons why the UN was largely ineffective throughout the Cold War, and even today, the worldviews of the permanent members of the Security Council are different enough that there's usually one or more who would use their veto authority to thwart direct action, like what happened in the Korean War. However, the Korean War is one of those rare instances where the UN actually backed up their rhetoric with action. You see, the China seat on the Security Council was given to the Republic of China. The Republic of China that's been kicked off the mainland and is now on Taiwan. Communist China doesn't have a seat at the UN, much less the Security Council. So the Communist Chinese are powerless to stop this resolution, and the Soviet Union is boycotting the United Nations out of protest because they think Communist China deserves the China seat on the Security Council. And so, with the memory of World War II fresh in their minds, the members of the UN Security Council passed Resolution 83 on June 27th, requesting that, quote, members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area, end quote. And so the Korean War would be waged under the flag of the United Nations. Although the United States would make up the bulk of the UN forces and have the top leadership positions throughout the conflict, 16 nations would contribute troops to Korea, to include over 14,000 troops from the UK, 8,000 from Canada, and 5,000 from Turkey. Within the United States, President Truman commits troops to the war in support of the UN resolution without asking Congress for a declaration of war or even having any discussions with Congress over U.S. intervention. This brings him under fire politically and muddies the water as to the purpose of the war. At a press conference, when questioned on the decision and whether or not the country was at war, a reporter asked Truman if it would be fair to call this effort a police action. And Truman responds, quote, yes, that is exactly what it amounts to, end quote. Truman was very concerned about communism on the march in Asia and being part of a larger plan by the Soviets and Chinese, and so he orders the U.S. 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to prevent Communist China from trying any amphibious invasion of Taiwan. These fears of China taking over Taiwan were not idle back then. Despite the lack of a dedicated navy, the People's Republic of China proved adept at crossing the 12-mile-wide strait separating Hainan Island from the mainland, and, despite being outnumbered 2-1, the superior morale of the communists led to victory in a few weeks. Crossing the Taiwan Strait would be much more challenging, being 100 miles wide, but it would also be foolish to dismiss such an operation as impossible. And so, Mao Zedong's ambitions of finishing the Civil War and conquering Taiwan has been foiled by the U.S., and the Communist Chinese were very upset at this action, seeing it as U.S. intervention against them in their internal civil war, but they don't have the ability to do anything about it. The U.S. support to Korea initially takes the form of ammunition and equipment supplies to the ROK Army and their use of air and sea power to protect the ports and airports around Pusan, located on the southeast corner of Korea, the port closest to Japan. And a quick aside on Korean city names. Today, the city name is translated as Busan with a B. This change in the spelling in English came about in the year 2000 as an effort to more accurately reflect how the name was pronounced in Korean. However, given that all the historical accounts talk about Pusan, I'm just going to use the historic 1950s pronunciations just for clarity. Due to the crisis, General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, is given command of U.S. forces in the region. He flies to Korea to see the situation for himself, and that dashes his initial confidence that the ROK Army would hold. Concerned about the collapse of the ROK Army, he convinces President Truman to commit significant ground forces to the peninsula and to authorize offensive action against the North Koreans, to include initiating a blockade of North Korea. Since MacArthur is a main character in this drama, we're going to take a closer look at him. Douglas MacArthur is a very divisive general, with ardent supporters on the one hand and equally strong opponents on the other. He's a 1903 West Point graduate who served as a brigadier general in World War I, was chief of staff of the Army during the interwar period, and served as the chief military advisor to the Philippines starting in 1935 up to the start of World War II. Once the war began, he commanded the U.S. and Filipino troops on the Philippines, though after 4 months of fighting, he was evacuated to Australia as the Japanese advanced through the Western Pacific. His troops continued to fight for another month before they surrendered, leading to the Bataan Death March and years of miserable imprisonment. MacArthur stated that, "I shall return" to the Philippines, and he ignored requests from Washington to amend his promise to "we shall return." During the war, MacArthur commanded Army forces in the South Pacific, fighting up the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, and finally returning to the Philippines in late 1944. During the fighting, he was adept at using amphibious operations to outflank Japanese positions, and at the end of the war, he remained in the Pacific and commanded troops occupying Japan and helping to reconstruct their country. As a person, MacArthur is a textbook prima donna and master showman. General Eisenhower, who served as an aide to MacArthur, recounted that he, quote, studied dramatics under him for 5 years in Washington and 4 years in the Philippines, end quote. MacArthur made little effort to publicize his subordinates' successes and took credit for them as his own. There's a reason why in Europe we hear of Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, whereas in the Pacific the only major Army figure you hear about is MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had significant political influence, and he was regarded as a hero for the defense of the Philippines. Now, this is probably more because the U.S. needed some good news in the bleak months at the start of the war than out of any brilliance in his tactics. But this influence is the reason why the U.S. supported 2 separate offensive drives against Japan in the Pacific. The Navy and the Marines wanted to island hop across the Central Pacific, much as War Plan Orange had envisioned in the pre-war planning. This would bypass large swaths of Japanese territory and military forces, but still positioned U.S. forces in a place where they could blockade, bombard, and ultimately invade the Japanese home islands. However, MacArthur didn't want to be relegated to a sideshow, and he certainly didn't want to be subordinate to a Navy admiral, and likewise the Navy didn't want to let a general run the Pacific War. So, having ample resources, the U.S. chose a third option. They gave the Navy the main role in the Central Pacific, and they gave MacArthur the main role in the South Pacific, and thankfully it turned out pretty well. Now, by 1950, MacArthur is 70 years old, aloof, and very much a man who does what he wants. He is one of only 3 5-star generals. Of the other 2, George C. Marshall has retired from the service, and while Dwight Eisenhower is still in the service, he is mostly doing advising work and is serving as the president of Columbia University. The 4th and final 5-star general would be Omar Bradley, Chief of Staff of the Army, though he wouldn't get promoted until a few months after the Korean War broke out. So, you have MacArthur, nominally taking orders from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even though he outranks them and is on the other side of the world from Washington. Furthermore, MacArthur had the chip on his shoulder from World War II. He resented the Europe First policy of the United States and thought that there were various plots by the Army leadership and George C. Marshall to try and sideline him. He surrounded himself with officers who tell him what he wants to hear, and he's an ardent anti-communist. Furthermore, he's a man who thinks that Asia is going to be the key battleground for the Cold War, and he sees the Korean War as one part of a broader crusade against communism itself. So this is going to set the stage for high drama in the coming year of the war, and indeed the Korean War will highlight MacArthur at his best, but also at his worst. But we'll get to that in due time. Back to the action. With the war breaking out so suddenly, the U.S. is hard-pressed to find the combat power to send to Korea. The immediate answer is to send troops on occupation duty over to Korea, the 24th Infantry Division being the most combat-ready of the 3 stationed there. However, combat ready in this case is very relative. In the post-World War II drawdown, huge budget cuts, and the U.S. nuclear monopoly, it meant that the Army was in a very poor state of readiness and training, particularly the Army in Japan on occupation duty. Commanders who had their troops do hard, realistic training had opposition both from the troops themselves and because any injuries caused during this training could lead to complaints to congressmen and congressional inquiries. Furthermore, many soldiers joined the Army to pay for college, and they had no intention of actually fighting a war. Finally, U.S. leaders operated on the assumption that a future war would play out similar to the previous two world wars. There would be probably 6 to 9 months to mobilize a massive army, fill out the ranks, and train the force before committing them to action. And besides, the U.S. is the only nation with an atomic bomb. Regardless, no one expected the occupation troops on Japan to be ready to fight another army, much less at the drop of a hat. As the Army is assembling the 24th Infantry Division and other units on Japan to go to fight, a battalion task force is sent over as the first ground forces able to be sent to the peninsula. This force consists of about 550 troops, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, and being a task force, that is, a force established for a specific task or activity, usually by taking a formation and attaching or detaching additional forces like trucks, artillery, or engineers. This force becomes known as Task Force Smith. Task Force Smith is a light infantry battalion with trucks for transportation and a battery of 6 105mm howitzers attached to them. The unit itself is at about 65% strength. For example, it only has 2 of its 3 authorized infantry companies because that's the way that the peacetime army was manned. They were at 2/3 strength, with that 3rd infantry company would be formed if a war broke out, be mobilized, and then we would have hundreds of thousands of troops to fill out the ranks. Lieutenant Colonel Smith is given vague orders and an overall intent to go as far north as possible and block the main road. The only general officer Lieutenant Colonel Smith talks to after he arrives on the peninsula is a Brigadier General Church, who merely tells him, quote, "All we need is some men up there who won't run away when they see tanks," end quote. The thought being that the South Korean soldiers didn't have the stomach to fight, and once the North Koreans realized that they were fighting America, they would decide to stop fighting and run away. Or at least, they'd be stopped by the army that stood up to the best that Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan could throw their way. Thankfully, finding a defensive position was fairly easy. The Korean peninsula is very mountainous, and there were few major roads in Korea at the time. So finding a position along the main road where he can block the enemy wasn't too difficult. Task Force Smith dug in on good terrain near the city of Suwon, about 15 miles south of the Han River. And sure enough, the North Koreans came, their advance led by a company of 8 T-34-85 tanks. The artillery opened fire, but the 105mm high explosive rounds were ineffective. When the tanks closed in further, the infantry opened up from concealed positions with 75mm recoilless rifles and the 2.36-inch bazookas of World War II vintage. However, these weapons were ineffective against the tanks and did no significant damage despite hitting them numerous times from the flank and the rear. Now, the Army did have more modern 3.5-inch bazookas, which could destroy T-34s. However, no one thought it was a priority to send those to occupation troops in Japan, and so none of them were in the Far East. Now, in a sign of utter contempt, the T-34s ignored the roadblock, since they didn't consider it to be a serious threat, and once they crested the ridge, the 105mm howitzers behind it engaged the T-34s with direct fire. However, once again, the standard high explosive rounds are ineffective against the tanks, and they only had 6 anti-tank rounds in their ammunition stocks. These anti-tank rounds were heat rounds, that is, shape-charged warheads, and those 6 shells ended up setting one tank on fire, damaged a second tank, but then they ran out of ammunition, and subsequent tanks fired upon and destroyed the gun. The North Korean tankers, wanting to continue their advance southward and not feeling threatened by the Americans at all, they just continued to advance south and ignore American fire. A follow-on force of 25 T-34s arrives an hour later, and while the 105mm guns were able to knock the tracks off of one tank and damage a few more, these tanks returned fire, destroying another howitzer, inflicting 20 casualties, and blowing up a number of parked trucks and jeeps behind the infantry line. These tanks also continued their advance south. Finally, a few hours later, 2 North Korean infantry regiments, about 5,000 troops strong, approached Task Force Smith in a 6-mile-long truck column with the tank platoon for escort. In a classic communication failure, the infantry had not received word from the tanks that there was an enemy infantry position along the road, and so Task Force Smith opens fire on the column at 1,000 yards. They destroy several trucks, but then the North Koreans deploy, suppress the American position with their tank platoon, and began maneuvering forces to outflank them. After 3 hours of fighting, Task Force Smith is low on ammunition, and Colonel Smith knows that they're being outflanked, and so he orders a phased withdrawal. This goes off smoothly until the end, where the last platoon in action doesn't get word to pull back until they realize everyone else has left, and then they end up running and leaving their wounded behind along with most of their equipment. The retreat quickly turns into a rout, and the survivors disperse and take heavy casualties. The stragglers make it back to friendly lines over the next 5 days, some of the stragglers having to eat turnips from the fields to feed themselves. And ultimately, Task Force Smith took 40% casualties, including 82 of them becoming prisoners of war. In all, the first showing of U.S. forces on the ground did not inspire confidence. The task force lasted about 7 hours in combat and was essentially destroyed. The U.S. Army was now reaping the rewards that they had sown in the post-war drawdown and low emphasis on training. In a world with atomic weapons, we were beginning to realize that you still needed to have a soldier on the ground to take or hold terrain and force the enemy to submit to your will. Furthermore, the U.S. soldiers had underestimated their enemies and were psychologically unprepared to fight a determined foe. After all, if your commander-in-chief said that this isn't really a war, but a police action, how hard do you expect the fight to be? Not only that, but Korea was a poor country emerging from decades of colonial rule. The American soldiers likely thought that they'd sweep away the enemy just like the Europeans did in their wars of colonial conquest. Well, in the days following Task Force Smith, the rest of the 24th Infantry Division arrives and occupies defensive positions at terrain choke points near Pyeongtaek, which is about 35 miles south of the Han River and close to the modern-day U.S. Army base at Camp Humphreys. The terrain favors the defender again, but the U.S. Army simply doesn't have the manpower, equipment, or training to take full advantage of that. The soldiers have whatever equipment they could scrape up in Japan, and they're short on ammunition, anti-tank weapons, and armored vehicles. The U.S. Air Force is much stronger than the North Korean Air Force, but they have little ability at this point in the war to deliver effective close air support against North Korean troops. Close air support is a term used to describe using air power against enemy troops that are in contact with friendly troops, that is, separated by anywhere from a few kilometers down to small arms fire range. This is a particularly challenging type of operation to conduct because of the risk of friendly fire. Aircraft are flying by at several hundred miles per hour, and they only have scant seconds to identify where the enemy is and where friendly forces are. If a pilot can't do this and has to make a second pass, that increases the danger to the pilot as enemy anti-aircraft defenses are now alerted to the aircraft's presence and are going to be trying to shoot it down. Another challenge is communication. The Army has different radios that use different frequencies than the Air Force aircraft do. So, ordinary ground troops and even artillery forward observers can't simply pick up the radio and talk to the pilot in the cockpit and tell him where to go. Instead, forward air controller detachments are assigned to ground forces with specialized training and radios that can talk to the pilots. A 24th ID, coming straight over from Japan, has no forward air controllers attached to their forces, and that leads to many instances of friendly fire from the Air Force against U.S. and ROC positions. The 24th Infantry Division can't hold against the North Koreans. They can only hope to slow them down and wait for additional forces to arrive. The North Koreans take advantage of the many gaps in the front line, in many cases caused by the hilly terrain in Korea. And so, if the North Koreans aren't able to take a position in an initial attack, they'll end up sending their forces around the flanks to infiltrate to the rear areas and then set up roadblocks or ambushes behind American lines. The North Koreans are very comfortable conducting operations at night or using subterfuge like disguising themselves as refugees. And there are many cases where U.S. patrols would advance down a road with no opposition, only to come back down the very same road and be ambushed by a machine gun emplacement along the route. This is very uncomfortable territory for the American officers and NCOs. Many of these leaders had combat experience from World War II and were good quality leaders, but they were used to fighting in a World War II style fight, where there were sufficient forces to form a continuous front line. Likewise, when they encountered a force in their rear areas, Their natural reaction was to try and pull back to avoid being cut off and surrounded. In Korea, though, fear of their enemy would often cause this to turn into, quote, bug-outs, end quote, where troops would be so afraid of their enemy that they would pull back and completely break contact with the North Koreans instead of conducting a fighting withdrawal to buy time and inflict casualties on the North Koreans. The foreign nature of the land, from the people, the language, even the smells, it literally stank thanks to the use of human excrement for fertilizer, plus unfamiliarity with the North Korean soldiers and their tactics, left a lot of unknowns in the minds of soldiers. This would cause many of the soldiers to fill that void with their own worst-case scenarios about what the North Korean hordes might be doing, especially at nighttime, where they might be sneaking around, setting up an ambush in their rear areas. Another cultural blind spot of the U.S. Army is that it thought primarily in terms of roads. The American Army was motorized, and there weren't any dedicated light infantry formations in Korea, and so naturally the leaders thought in terms of advancing along the road, since that was the only means they could logistically sustain such a vehicle-heavy force, and it also offered the fastest route of travel. From an infantryman's perspective, it's also the path of least resistance. After all, the hills in Korea are large and steep, and so less disciplined soldiers would want to avoid climbing those mountains and would rather stay on their vehicles. Why walk when you can ride, right? Colonel John Michaelis, the 27th Infantry Regiment commander, gave his assessment of U.S. soldiers at the start of the Korean War, slightly edited for language. Quote, "In peacetime training, we've gone for too much Valderall. We've put too much stress on information and education and not enough stress on rifle marksmanship and scouting and patrolling and the organization of a defensive position. These kids of mine have all the guts in the world, and I can count on them to fight. But when they started out, they couldn't shoot. They didn't know their weapons. They have not had enough training in plain, old-fashioned musketry. They'd spend a lot of time listening to lectures on the difference between communism and Americanism and not enough time crawling on their bellies on maneuvers with live ammunition singing over them. They've been nursed and coddled, told to drive safely, to buy war bonds, to give to the Red Cross, to avoid VD, to come home to mother, when somebody ought to have been telling them how to clear a machine gun when it jams. The U.S. Army is so roadbound that the soldiers have almost lost the use of their legs. Send out a patrol on a scouting mission, and they load up in a 3/4-ton truck and start riding down the highway." End quote. A reconnaissance detachment staying on their vehicles is an even worse proposition, as it is much easier for the enemy to detect them, and the engine noise prevents the soldiers from hearing enemy soldiers. And they also aren't able to cover the hills and the mountains in between the roads to detect enemy forces there. Well, the North Koreans continued their advance, outflanking U.S. positions and driving the 24th Infantry Division further and further south. In spite of the retreats, the U.S. Army is learning how to fight. Its leadership is usually good, and there are many cases of bravery. For example, in the urban fighting around Chonan, about 50 miles south of the Han River, the commander of the 34th Infantry Regiment, Colonel Robert Martin, ends up earning a Distinguished Service Cross in the fighting. I'll read part of his citation. Quote, "Colonel Martin distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action against enemy aggressor forces in Chonan, Korea on 8 July 1950. Observing enemy tanks and infantry in force penetrated his regiment's forward position, Colonel Martin, with total disregard for his own personal safety, rushed forward to organize and personally led rocket launcher and grenade attacks against the tanks and infantry at ranges of 10 to 20 yards. Despite heavy small arms fire and tank gun fire, Colonel Martin, by his heroic example, so inspired his men that they destroyed several tanks and forced others to retire, thereby preventing the enemy from immediately overrunning the position. During this action, Colonel Martin lost his life while single-handedly attacking an enemy tank with a rocket launcher at a range of about 15 yards." End quote. By mid-July, more reinforcements have arrived. The 1st Cavalry Division and 25th Infantry Division joined the front lines, and U.S. forces are slowly getting better at fighting, and retreats are becoming more orderly. The UN forces finally stopped the North Koreans along what would be called the Pusan Perimeter, a zone about 50 miles across east to west and 100 miles north to south. That position is anchored in the west along the Naktong River and the mountains in the north, and then the city of Daegu, that is Daegu in modern speak, forms an anchor in the northwest corner of the pocket. It's now July 27th, 1 month into the war. About 80% of South Korea has fallen to the communists. But there is hope. There's enough combat power in Korea that the U.S. 8th Army headquarters, which was responsible for occupation duties in Japan, is now moved to the Pusan Perimeter, and Lieutenant General Walton Bulldog Walker is in command. General Walker served as a corps commander under Patton in World War II, and both him and MacArthur are determined to hold the line and that there will not be a Dunkirk-style evacuation. With the shortened front line, UN forces are barely strong enough to form a continuous, if then, battle line. Besides the 3 U.S. divisions from Japan, there are 5 understrength Rock Army divisions manning the line, and this shattered remnants of the pre-war army is being augmented with whatever able-bodied men the South Koreans are able to find. Due to the relentless North Korean advance and their continued aggressive attacks on the front, the UN forces think they are significantly outnumbered and that the North Koreans are just gathering enough strength for one final blow to collapse the front line. In reality, it's the North Koreans who are getting desperate. UN forces actually slightly outnumber the North Korean army. Although their advances had been shocking and rapid, the North Korean army suffered almost 60,000 casualties in the fighting, about half of its pre-war strength. Many of these formations are at half strength and have resorted to enlisting Korean civilians at gunpoint to augment their forces. The majority of these casualties were inflicted by the Rock Army. Though they could not hold the line against the North Koreans and there was a lot of panic at the start of the war, they did still inflict a lot of casualties as they withdrew. Furthermore, the U.S. now has a 5-to-1 advantage in tanks and complete air and sea supremacy. Aircraft were flying interdiction strikes, destroying bridges, rail lines, supply convoys, and reinforcements in the North Korean rear areas. The North Koreans are also operating far from their supply bases, whereas U.S. supply lines are short and their air bases close to the front. Now, attacking an enemy when you're at half strength, low on supplies, and potentially outnumbered is not something that most Western military leaders would do. But the North Koreans weren't raised in the Western military tradition, and they realize that this is their last chance to win decisively, and so they're willing to fight relentlessly and pay a high price to achieve victory. In August, the North Koreans launch attacks at all points along the perimeter, trying to find a weak spot they can break through. An additional factor in them attacking multiple points on the perimeter instead of concentrating in one spot is that U.S. air supremacy limits the ability of the North Koreans to relocate their forces rapidly and would open them up to air attacks and also would ruin the element of surprise, allowing UN forces to reposition themselves against the North Koreans. So the North Koreans attack in 3 areas. The first is along the mountainous east coast, where the North Koreans envelop the ROK 3rd Division by leaving their vehicles and leaving the roads so they can literally climb over the mountains and outflank them. The North Koreans succeed in cutting off the division, but then the U.S. Navy simply sails up to the coastline and picks up the ROK Division and transports it back to friendly lines. The North Korean forces here are unable to continue their advance and their attack stalls. To the west, along the Naktong River, the North Korean attack makes headway against the 24th Infantry Division, crossing the river in an undefended spot. But just when it seems like another breakthrough is going to occur, Walker commits the Provisional Marine Brigade, a brigade of Marines hastily assembled from various units across the theater, and the Marines counterattack, and at the cost of heavy casualties, they blunt the North Korean advance and throw them back across the Naktong River after several days of heavy fighting. In general, the Marines are much more aggressive and better prepared for their baptism of fire than the Army troops so far. And there are cultural reasons for this, including the fact that since the Marines are much smaller than the Army, they can be a lot more selective when it comes to their recruits. And in general, the Marines tend to specialize in aggressive actions and blunt force trauma. While the North Koreans in late August attacked to seize Daegu, but again, after some headway, they don't have enough strength to exploit their initial advances, and the U.S. and ROK forces halt them and then counterattack to drive them back. The stage is now set for a new phase in the war, where UN forces are able to retake the initiative and drive the communists back north. Indeed, MacArthur has been husbanding reserve forces in Japan for just such a counterattack, a bold, daring operation to land troops deep behind enemy lines at a place called Incheon. It's an operation so fraught with danger that the U.S. Navy and the Joint Chiefs of Staff think it's a fool's errand. Well, we'll discuss all that and more on the next episode of the Wheels of History podcast. If you know anyone out there who might be interested in the podcast, please share this with them. And if you enjoyed this series, please consider supporting the Wheels of History podcast. For just $5 less than the cost of a Subway sandwich, you can gain access to bonus episodes that I publish with each series, covering more details on myself, the sources I use in the research, and some of the equipment used by both sides in the war. Thank you very much, have a great day, and I'll see you next time on the Wheels of History podcast.